Illinois House passed a bill today with the goal of preventing a tragedy similar to the hazmat crash near Teotopolis, Illinois last September. The bill would require the Secretary of State to post hazmat signs as well as information about how hazardous materials are transported in the state's Rules of the Road book. It comes after 5 people died in the Teotopolis crash involving a truck carrying anhydrous ammonia.
We have to include hazardous material placards so they know that when they get around larger trucks or larger vehicles that have these hazardous material placards, that they should be a little bit more careful as they decide to pass or how they drive around those vehicles.
The bill has passed unanimously through the House. It now heads to Governor Pritzker's desk.